Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's Adaptations and Future webinar on continuity of operations planning. I can see the attendee list still ticking up, so I'm going to just give it another half a minute or so as people join on. All right, I think we have a robust enough group on the call now. Welcome. My name is Marguerite Harden. I am the local resiliency manager at the Colorado Resiliency Office. And for those of you who don't know, we are doing this webinar as part of a broader series that we're calling the Adaptations and Future Webinar Series, which we've launched in response to COVID, but has a lot of really applicable information for the many disasters and responses and recovery and resiliency building that we are coordinating throughout the state. And I'm really excited about today's webinar. It has that sort of broad applicability on pre-disaster planning and the importance of continuity of operations planning. Can you advance to the next slide? Great. So I just want to encourage everyone before I hand it off to our moderator to use the chat throughout and the question panel throughout for any of the questions that come up as you are going through the webinar. We would love to hear from you, and we will have a time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and you can view this webinar as well as our many others on our website that I just dropped into the chat. And we're so glad to have you here, and we're so glad to have this conversation. So with that, I've been really lucky to be able to work with Clay Brown, who, DOLA has a number of regional managers that are working very closely within their communities. Clay is assigned to the Central region, and he has been kind enough to organize this topic. He has a wealth of knowledge on COOP and pre-disaster planning, and I'm really excited to hear from him and our speakers. So with that, over to you, Clay.
Thanks, Marguerite. As Marguerite said, I'm Clay Brown. I'm the regional manager for the Department of Local Affairs out of the Golden office. I've been with DOLA since 2002, and actually shortly after getting hired, had the experience of the Hayman fire. And unfortunately, we've experienced way too many disasters in our state, from fire, snowstorms, flood, and now we're seeing cyber attacks. One of the roles we perform as regional managers is that we come in and assist the local governments during that response phase, as our partners at DHSEM are helping manage resources with the emergency managers. We come in to help the administrative side, if you will, the elected officials and managers with their responsibilities towards the disaster, and help start with that short-term recovery. And one of the things that we have found when we've come into communities, especially small communities, is that they don't have a lot of pre-planning for disasters, or if they have it, it's limited to perhaps certain types of disasters. And later on, you're going to hear from Lori Hodges, and she's going to talk a little bit about the breadth of disasters, so that we're not so focused always on the natural disaster. And so one of the challenges is that we come in and we need to be able to work with the folks, and if it is a flood that has displaced the unit of local government, it makes it a lot more of a challenge. And so what we really have been trying to do is to follow up and hope that after the disasters, we get and encourage people to do continuity of government, continuity of operations planning. And with the whole COVID-19 situation, we don't want to lose the opportunity for everyone to do this process, even as it relates to a pandemic. Typically, people think about, well, the COOP planning is how to continue your operations when you are displaced. So, for example, in Manitou Springs, where the city hall sits in the floodway, it had to be evacuated several times, so needed to find a new location. In this COVID outbreak, I think everybody's quickly adapted, even if they didn't have a COOP, with the remote communications with the technology that we have today. But there's much more to it. It's about maintaining essential services. It's about being able to continue the government in an efficient manner, and it's understanding the assets that you have and how to manage those assets. So I think it's a great topic. I'm really excited with our speakers today. The first speaker is going to be Tara Schettinger. She's the mayor of Jamestown. Tara and I spent a long time together after the Great Flood of 2013, which devastated the community. And they had about $30 million of damages, to put it in perspective. The flood destroyed 20% of the homes and took the life of the town's patriarch. So after that flood, Tara also served in the role of being the recovery manager, which they are still working on. Boulder County is still recovering from that great flood. The second speaker is Lori Hodges. Lori is the director of Larimer County Office of Emergency Management. Lori is a veteran of many disasters. Prior to Larimer County, she worked for Park County, and then she came to the state of Colorado, worked at DHSEM, where I got to meet Lori and work with her. She's highly respected in the field. I call her an expert. She's contributed greatly to the Local Government Guide to Recovery, which is one of the resources we have listed for you. She's an active member of Colorado Emergency Management Association, and we're really happy to have her, especially since she is in the response mode on the Cameron Peak fire. So really appreciate her taking some time to meet with all of you today. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So the first part of the webinar today is going to be a conversation with Tara about the Jamestown experience. And as I said, Tara and I worked together for quite a while, but that was after the flood, and the community was cut off from the rest of the world for a while. And during that time, that response took place, and Tara had a lot of responsibilities. And to be honest with you, I'm not that familiar with what happened in those immediate days after the event, because I came in later. So I wanted to ask Tara some questions about that experience to kind of help illustrate how COOP planning can help manage the response and the response to the disaster. So thanks, Tara, for meeting with us today.
Thanks, Clay.
So you were cut off from the outside world. The townspeople, most of them were evacuated by helicopter. And so you remained behind to help take care of the town. Tell us, I mean, what was the pre-disaster planning that the town had? Did you even have, a plan and that laid out what the role of the mayor was?
We had an emergency response plan that I know we put together years before, but I'm not sure that anybody knew necessarily what was in it or where to find it at the time. You're right in that everybody in our community was evacuated by helicopter. We evacuated over 300 people and all of our animals by helicopter. And in fact, I thought I was actually supposed to evacuate as well. I thought I was a burden by staying behind, until one of the incident commanders from Boulder County explained to me that I actually couldn't leave because I was the only legal representative for the town. So that was news to me. And so we stuck around, but we had no real plan. what to do in a time like that.
So with the amount of destruction there was, what challenges did you have when it came to communications? How did you communicate with the townspeople in Boulder where they're evacuated, or the town board members, or just within the community?
Yeah, during the days in which we were the flood was occurring, because it occurred over many days, and we began our air evacuation, which also took several days. I communicated with them with a bullhorn, which was kind of funny, but we had no power, no phone, no communication with the outside world other than with, we had one resident that's part of the left-hand fire protection district, which is the fire protection district that surrounds Jamestown. And he actually had a pack set that could get on the channel with Boulder County. And he was on one side of the creek, which there were no crossings of the creek left. And I was on the other, and we communicated over our pack sets, our radios, and he was able to communicate with downtown and let us know what Boulder Communications was planning in terms of our evacuation. And then after that, and everybody evacuated, there were several days before they were able to doze a road in from the top, from the Peak to Peak Highway. And during that time, there were only a handful of us left. And we still had, the recovery of Joey, who died. And so that's why they were pushing the road in, was so that the search and recovery team could come in. But that was about 5 days afterwards. And so up until that time, we had no communication with outside other than with just Boulder County Communications and just around the immediate disaster response. And then after that, I was able to get out and go down to Boulder, and Boulder County commissioners gave us their hearing room to use, where we could have community meetings and board meetings.
Right, so a change of location on the fly, to where with a continuity of operations plan, that might have been already identified, and everybody would have known that's where you were going to have your meetings, or these days having it an ordinance that allows you to have electronic meetings, which everybody probably has now from COVID, but those are definitely the benefits of having that continuity of operations plan. So one of the first things we encourage the DHSEM, encourages local government to do is to declare a disaster. And these days, I think people are very good at that. But you're cut off from the outside world. Your board is down in Boulder. How did you guys even declare a disaster so that you could start mobilizing resources?
Yeah, that was a good question. And I actually didn't even know that was a thing to do. Unlike Lori, I hadn't really experienced disasters before in my role as mayor. And I got an email from Boulder County. I think it was Michelle Krizik who was instructing me that we needed to do that. And so it was basically sort of following the direction of Boulder County in terms of what we needed to do in order to be able to mobilize resources and be included in the disaster declaration.
Great. You worked with Boulder County very closely. You continue to work closely with the county, and you guys have a great relationship. But did you have like an intergovernmental agreement or anything ahead of time that kind of spelled out what assistance the county could give, or roles or responsibilities or anything like that?
No, we didn't. And in fact, that was a bit of an issue because FEMA and DHSEM wanted to have those types of intergovernmental agreements in place prior to the disaster in order to comply with federal regulations. And we did not, but we were able to put in place an IGA for flood recovery services And honestly, we couldn't have done that without their support and the support of the state. Our recovery would have never happened.
Great. Yeah, I think it's really important to have those agreements in place. I was working in one community where they had a flood and the county came in immediately to help them. And then after helping them for a couple days left, and at the town was going, well, wait a minute, aren't you going to stay? This, well, no, you know, we can only do so much until we need to start charging you. So they didn't have an agreement. And it was really hard then for them to afterwards do the agreement because they were at a little bit of a dispute over who was supposed to be doing what. So definitely the pre-planning is really, really important. One of the things, you know, with COOP planning, we try to do is to make sure that there's ways to keep the operations going. And so having backup systems in place. So for example, finances, you know, having the ability to pay your bills, to be able to take care of things, do request for supplies, having that system identified so it could be in place is would be in place is really important. In your situation, I know that the town clerk also was evacuated besides the board. So how did you guys figure out how to pay your bills and things like that?
Yeah, that was a bit of a challenge as well. Our post office was closed, and so for a long time, and so it was difficult to figure out where we were going to get our mail with the bills. And when our town clerk evacuated, fortunately, she took the town computer with her, but we didn't have a web version of QuickBooks, which is what we use. And so it was the only version of that was on her computer. And she's now out in Fort Lupton living with family after being evacuated from her home. And yeah, it was quite challenging for us to figure out how to pay bills and coordinate on that, since I had very little communications up here and didn't have the ability to write checks up here. She didn't have access to mail and what was going on and the needs of that we had up here in order to be able to provide the financial support we needed.
Yeah, and along the same lines, I think, you know, one of the things we encourage folks to do is to have a backup of all of their important documents. And so in the old days, it was microfiche or paper copies in cardboard boxes stored up high on a shelf where it wouldn't get wet. But nowadays, obviously, we have a lot more tools at our disposal. But what about that? I mean, was it hard for you guys to retrieve important documents?
Yeah, we had the papers and cardboard box system here at the time of the flood, and so and it wasn't my system, and I didn't really know exactly where to find things because that was something that the town clerk took care of. So it was quite difficult. And since then, we have put scanned everything in through the help of a consultant, and now have all of that stored in the cloud for anybody to be able to access.
Awesome, that's great. So let's just wrap with a final question, kind of an open question. In hindsight, are there any other things that you wish you would have had in place that would have made the response or the start of recovery more efficient or better that you can think of?
I wish that we had all these things already predetermined, that it wasn't something that we had to work through. It just added to the stress and the pressure of the disaster at the time. And I think having this continuity of operations plan and all of these things outlined that we've been talking about would have been super helpful at that time, for sure.
Great. And I just want to thank you again. I know this has been a huge part of your life, and you've worked really, really hard for the town of Jamestown. I know how many hours you were putting in back then, and they were really lucky to have you be their mayor at the time.
Well, that's kind of you. And I think you know how many hours I was putting in because you were right there with me. So thank you.
Me, yes. Great, thank you. Let's go to Lori. Lori's going to cover a little bit more of the technical parts of COOP planning and the components and how to get started in this process. So let me turn it over to Lori Hodges from Larimer County.
All right, are you guys able to hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. So as Clay said, I'm Lori Hodges. I'm the emergency manager for Larimer County. My background is I was a paramedic firefighter, and then as Clay mentioned, I've been an emergency manager both at the local and state levels. And because Larimer County is a disaster county, I helped with some state documents when I worked at the state. I helped with the local emergency management program guide that just talks to emergency managers about what they do, and then the local guide to recovery as well, which I think is a good guide. You have a lot of people talking at you during recovery from state and federal levels, but multiple different agencies. So we really wanted to create something with the Colorado Resiliency Office that was focused in on what local governments really need to know from other locals. So if you haven't looked at that guide, it's a good one. So today, if you want to flip to the next slide, today I'm just going to be talking a little bit about first, why is COOP planning important, continuity of operations planning. I'm also going to talk a little bit about continuity of government planning, because that will also trip you up quite a bit if you don't have that. It's a much easier plan to do, pretty simple. The continuity of operations plan is pretty extensive, but it's highly valuable to you. So I'm going to talk about some of the components of the COOP planning, because I think that this plan, it seems overwhelming to folks when they're trying to figure it out. But really, if you break it into a couple of key phases and scenarios, then I think it makes it a little bit easier. And then there's 3 different types of assessments that go into a COOP plan, so I'll talk about that too. And then kind of how do you put that plan into action? So once you have the plan, once you have an incident, how do you actually activate the plan? What's involved in that? Who should be on the teams? I can give you a little bit of information about that as well. So next slide. And I talk really fast too, so if I'm going too fast, just let me know. So why should you plan? As we've all seen, COVID is a really good example of an unplanned, unpredictable event. It was, probably one of the most complex events from a continuity of operations perspective, because it involved every single person in, the world, in the United States, as far as having to have some alternate procedures. We've talked about virtual procedures for a long time. Some governments were just really against it, against remote working. So this kind of forced that issue a little bit to see what can work and what can't work. Also, Larimer County had we've had 2 cyber events that have happened to us, where the first one we lost our data for up to 2 weeks, and for critical functions like the district attorney's office and the assessor's office, other elected bodies. It really becomes problematic because they have statutory requirements to meet. So those cyber events are really critical as well. And then we also had, just a contractor who was changing a light bulb on the 5th floor of our main building, and they left the door open to the roof. And that night we had freezing temperatures, and so the pipes froze in the building, causing a bunch of water to flow through our elevator system, and it ruined, the 5th floor and the 4th floor. So, it could be something just that small that causes a disruption in your workplace that then you have to work through. So having the plan in place decreases the stress level for everybody. You know what needs to be done, who you need to call, and it's just so much easier if you have the plan in place ahead of time. So that's why you should plan. If you ever have questions about that, I have some other horror stories for you. All right, so next slide. All right, so I mentioned some scenarios to you guys, and this is what I think is probably the most important thing about continuity of operations planning. You really have 3 things that you're planning for. You're planning for a people-driven outage, so your people, for whatever reason, can't get to work. It could be maybe there's a hazmat incident in the neighborhood and they've closed off the area, right? Or in the flood, we had a lot of areas that were closed off. So if people can't actually get to a facility that's good, and they have technology that can work, but it's at that work, you're going to need to figure out that virtual operation. So this is what we've gone through for COVID, is people cannot come to work because they might infect others. Therefore, we need to do virtual operations. How do we make that work, and how do we keep things going? The next one is facility driven. So like I mentioned, if you have damages to a facility, or for whatever reason a facility is out, you're going to need to figure out how to relocate all those people for a short period of time or a long period of time to a different facility and get them set up with the technology that they need to do their jobs. So people driven, facility driven. And then the third one is technology driven. Like we mentioned, that's more of the cyber thing, where you have the people, you have the facilities, but for whatever reason, you have a data failure or you have a technology failure, and therefore they can't functionally do their jobs. Those are the three things. If you really break down continuity of operations planning to just how do we plan for people being out, how do we plan for a facility being down, and how do we plan for a technology problem, you're going to be well on your way. So, and then we do have a fourth scenario in our plan. It's not really something that we can plan a lot for other than expanding our teams and determining different ways to do what we do. And that is really the catastrophic thing. It's multiple buildings, large areas. So, for example, if the 2013 flood was a good example of just a wide scale area that just destroyed a lot of stuff in its path. So there were some towns, that really lost most of what they had. In that case, really, you're going to have to regroup and kind of start at a new place in a catastrophic environment where now you're going to have to determine maybe outside of your area completely, how are we going to function? So those are the four scenarios. Next slide. And so we have those outlined in our plan. And then the way that we address those four scenarios, or we do some assessments. So we do three different kinds of assessments. The first one is every building that's owned by the county, we assess that building for what is its square footage, how many people work there, where is it located, is it in a hazard area, just all the details specific to that building itself. And then who are the contacts for that building? If anything does go wrong, we outline that. So we have a one-pager for each building that really just gives you the details. So if we have a building failure for whatever reason, you pull out that one page and it gives you everything that you need to at least start the process. The next one is, I have personnel assessments. It's really department assessments. So we have another one-pager or maybe two-pagers that really just talks about the department as a whole. How many people work in that department, which buildings do they work in, who are the key department heads, who are their backups. And then we ask some very critical questions about, how many of your people have the ability to do remote working? How many workstations would be essential to have if you couldn't work in your current facility? So we just ask a few critical questions within that worksheet that then allows us to get together with our core operations team, which I'll talk about. And then we can really start working through, okay, what does IT need to be able to do for this department if this department goes down? Maybe it's some pre-planning stuff, like we realized in the COOP plan that they are not at all ready for what's going to possibly happen to us. So we need to beef up maybe remote learning, or we need to find another facility that might be able to house them. So anyway, we have the building assessments, and then we have those department assessments or office assessments that we do that involves really who are the personnel as far as key personnel in each area, and what are all the details about how that department works. And then it also has what are the regulatory, statutory requirements for that department or agency. So a lot of our elected offices, like I mentioned, have statutory requirements. We list that as well so that we know, if they have to do something within 7 days, we have to have a plan for how they can do that. And then the equipment assessment is part of that too. What equipment do they use? How well can they use it remotely? What equipment would they need if they went down, so that we know if IT needs to stand up some extra equipment for them. So those are kind of some of the assessments that we do through the planning thing. And then I did want to talk about continuity of government, because there isn't a lot of talk about this, and it's super huge because in statute for every elected office, it is very specific about who covers for them when they're out. And in some cases, it has to go to maybe the Republican or the Democratic Party to establish a new person, right? And that takes a lot of time. And if you have things that have to happen, you don't have the time to wait for that kind of a process. So within the continuity of government plan, we have a very simple plan. All that it does is it lists all those people, all those essential personnel that are department heads or elected offices. And it says in that plan what the statute says about replacing that person, and then how that person is going to be replaced. So we have it actually named by, not person, but we have it named by position. for each individual who's their replacement, and that they will have the full authority if that person is not able to do the job. So for example, say that you have somebody who's in Puerto Rico and they have that earthquake out there and they can't fly back and they're out of pocket. That continuity of government plan allows us to then make all those decisions from that next available person. Or if you have somebody who's injured for whatever reason in the disaster or another reason, or you can't find them, we've had that as well where we just can't get a hold of them. The county commissioners from a county perspective are super important here too, because for a disaster declaration, when I was in Park County, our policy said that I had to get signatures from all 3 commissioners in order to declare. And we had a blizzard that lasted 6 weeks. And I had to drive my car in that blizzard to each of the commissioners' homes to get that declaration signed so we could get it to the state, because that was our policy. So after that, we changed the policy to where one commissioner could sign the declaration, and then it would just be signed by the full board at the next available meeting. So that's very important to look through for you guys. A couple of things on that too is, and this was kind of mentioned, those agreements that were mentioned earlier, as well as emergency waivers, are really important. And this is where this comes in, is continuity of government. If you don't have waivers in your policy for disaster, you can really get tripped up. So you should be looking at, your procurement policies or other policies, just like the declaration policy, and see what it says and see if anything there is going to trip you up. And then you just have to have a waiver that says, under these conditions, we're going to change this policy to X. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Go ahead to the next one. All right, and then just remember that most disasters do not happen Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. Most of our disasters are one on a holiday weekend. I guarantee you, holiday weekends, I hate them because we always have something happen. And that's when you can't get a hold of anybody, which is why in continuity of operations planning, it's so important to have after hours numbers for everything. And then you're going to have those threats that are no warning, that are either during business hours or not during business hours, that are going to be much harder because it's all of a sudden something happens and you have to react quickly. The ones with warning, you can plan, you can get your teams together, but a lot of times we're not going to have that warning. So just keep that in mind when you're planning. Next question, or next slide. So when you activate your COOP, it could involve just a lot of different things. It could be the movement of your personnel to an alternate facility for whatever reason. A lot of you need to figure out who your essential people are that cannot go without working. And then where are they going to work if they're out of their facility? You might need to create those temporary work procedures, which a lot of people did during COVID. You might need to provide them additional equipment or resources. So knowing who next to you, not just your organization, because we don't always have like a warehouse sitting out there with a bunch of extra stuff we can use in the event of an emergency, but you could have an agreement with another county. Like we could have an agreement with Weld or Boulder to where we share some stuff. And then it could involve the delegation of your emergency authorities to successors of senior management. So again, that continuity of government's important. And then just the coordination of kind of the personnel, the emergency responders in the private sector, kind of coordinating all that together, because these emergencies involve a lot of outside partners. And so there has to be some kind of coordination between the government entity and the emergency itself. And having an emergency manager helps with that because that's kind of part of their job. But if you don't have that, then those are just some of the things that activation of a COOP might involve. Next slide. So how do you act once you get your COOP plan done? You've done your assessment, you kind of know where you're at. The next phase is really who needs to be involved. How do you actually put that plan into action? What does it look like when you have an event? So that's what this piece is about, is your plan should really address, once activated, this is what needs to occur. The next slide. In Larimer County, we have 3 phases that we've outlined and we have a plan for. So phase 1 is kind of the activation, whether it's a no warning or a warning event. This is really that first 24 hours, what needs to occur, and who needs to be involved, who needs to be notified. Phase 2 is kind of that movement of people trying to get to a new normal, whatever that looks like. And then phase 3 is the end of the emergency, getting people back to where they belong. And it could be in a new facility, you never know. So those are our phases. Go ahead to the next slide. And then, as I mentioned, we have developed 2 teams. We have an executive team, which is really, for us, it's the county commissioners, the sheriff's office, it's our PIO, our IT department, and emergency management, and facilities. Those are kind of the in the executive team, it's the people who have the information so that the senior leaders can make determinations on what needs to happen. And obviously, if it involves another elected body, we would put them into that executive team as well. The operations team is really the people, the boots on the ground who do stuff. So again, this includes facilities and IT because they're core people for COOP planning, but it also involves any other department that might be impacted, any agency with responsibility for essential functions. So the operations team is bigger, but it's also very dependent upon the disaster itself, and it changes quite a bit, where the executive team really doesn't change very much. Next slide. This next slide just shows you a few examples of our operations team. So facilities, emergency management, information technology, public information, leadership, subject matter experts from different areas. So actually this is the executive team, sorry about that. And then we would add in the people for the ops team as needed, depending on the threat. So when you guys are developing your teams, it's important to know that you need one team for decision making. Maybe it's a budget concern, maybe it's something else, and then one team that are really the operators, the people who are going to solve the problem. So an example of this was our IT department, you know, in that cyber event, the first one, they didn't think to call emergency management. They were just handling everything. And during the event, they just said that they were overwhelmed with calls from all the departments and they couldn't, you know, get off the phone long enough to fix the problem. So we told them, hey, emergency management can take that on for you, all the messaging. And so we did that for the second event, and it really went much better. So we had just a core operations team that we created, and we worked with IT to find out what did they need to do, how do we take the burden off of them so they can, their whole job was to solve the problem, and our job was to ensure everybody had good information. So next slide. I think this is about the end. Finally, just don't wait to begin planning. Everybody puts off these emergency plans, and then when you need it, you really need it. So I would definitely put this on your radar and get somebody to work on it, even if it's just a little bit at a time. It'll definitely help you in the long run. So that was a lot. So any questions for me, or I don't know if I pass this back over to Clay.
So Lori, this is Clay. You talked about succession planning. You talked about having, you know, who was going to be on that executive team, who was needed to make decisions. And a question for you is, how deep do you go? I was in a community, and I asked, well, if the mayor's not available, who's in charge? And they said, oh, the mayor pro tem. And I said, well, what happens if the mayor pro tem's out of town? And they kind of looked at each other and went, we don't know. So when you're doing that planning, how far do you recommend folks go in depth to have somebody to assume those responsibilities in your plan?
So we recommend 2 deep. So who's the person that takes over when you're gone, and who's the person who takes over for them. When we get into the department level, it's a lot easier at that level than it is the executive level, because again, there are some statutory considerations for that. So in our continuity of government plan, for some of those where you know, the successor has to be picked by the party, or the state of Colorado picks the successor while we're doing something. In that case, we just pick the 1 level down, and then that process starts, and then they're going to pick somebody. So it really depends on the position, but as a whole, we try to do the 2 deep for the reason that you just mentioned.
Great, thank you. So if an organization wants to start their planning, what's your suggestion for getting started? You've mentioned that some people feel like that's overwhelming, but I think you've done a good job of explaining really why it's so critical. How do you get somebody started in this process?
So a couple things. One is, you know, you had kind of your base plan that just goes over your basic administration, how you activate. That's pretty easy to kind of work through. FEMA has a template for that, so you can just walk through that template and answer those questions. For the building assessments and the department assessments, we have a form that I would be happy to share with the group, where it'll show you the questions that we need answered. And if you do have some facilities folks, they're going to know the answers to most of those questions. That's a really good place to start, because that gets you your bare data that you need, and it also tells you where your gaps are. So I would really start with the templates that are out there for continuity of operations planning, because you can't find many continuity of operations plans out there because they're private, and like ours is the only plan that we don't put up on our website. So start there and then start with those assessments. That would be the first step. And then again, if you have this PowerPoint, look at those 3 different scenarios of the people-driven, facility-driven, or data-driven, and start outlining that from your assessments. That would be a good way to start.
Great. And I have one more question. The elected officials and their roles, do you guys do training with your elected officials so they understand what their roles are in an emergency or a disaster, and how these plans work?
Yes, so we do policy group trainings once a quarter, where I have an hour or 2 hours, usually it's about an hour, with the county commissioners, and then we invite in other elected officials depending on the scenario and have them work through some of the policy and executive decisions that would be needed. And we do that a lot with COOP events. I've been told by Linda I can't do that anymore because we had a COOP training, and that's the night that they had the light bulb that caused the flooding. So she thought I caused the event. But anyway, so yeah, we do the training quarterly, bring in different people for a different type of event. Like cyber, we'll bring in our cybersecurity person and our facilities person in IT, and then they can answer those technical questions with the board. And then we'll bring in some of the other elected bodies to talk about their statutory requirements. We also sometimes do department or office training. So they'll bring us in to talk to their staff and their key senior leadership for that elected office. So yes, I would definitely encourage doing planning and training and exercise prior to an event. It definitely helps. It gets some of those questions out of the way, and then people know a little bit better about how to move forward.
Awesome, thank you. I have a question for Tara. As an elected official, did you have a staff person, someone who's longer term or not subject to election cycles, that was aware of the procedures and policies for the operations, so it didn't rest all on your shoulders?
Well, that would have been the town clerk, because we only have 1 employee of the town. And I imagine that there was some of this that she was aware of and or could have easily put her hands on. But I think the problem was that all of the ordinance and resolutions and policies and procedures were here, and she was evacuated.
Right. Okay, thank you. Ollie, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Am I missing some?
I don't think you are, Clay. Yeah,
Oh,
but if anyone else has any questions, feel free to drop them in there now. Someone did ask if we were going to get copies of the presentations, and we will be posting that on our website. We'll also be putting that out in an email to everyone who's registered for this webinar, so stay tuned for that. And since I don't see any other questions and answers coming in, maybe I'll move on to some of the resources that we have. So thank you, Clay, for facilitating that and some of your questions. Yeah. So something that I really like about our webinar series is that we have a companion piece that we develop based on the webinar, and it links to a lot of different resources. I know you can't click on the slide, so I'm going to drop this link that I have on the slide in the chat right now. And Clay referenced this resource. It's the Local Government Guide to Recovery that Lori was involved in creating, and it's really valuable. It's in the chat now, and it will also be in this companion piece that we'll be developing. Next slide. Oh, and also the state, the CRO, is also working on pre-disaster recovery plan templates and guidance and model ordinance language that is forthcoming. So stay tuned for that. We just got a consultant on board that's going to help us with that, and it's moving along quickly. Next slide. And I also just want to make everyone aware that there is a winter adaptation survey that is due tomorrow. We have a number of responses, but we are looking for more insight into what local governments are doing in order to prepare for the winter during a COVID season. So that link should be in the chat right now. I'm sorry, the link isn't. Let me just copy that. And next slide. And this is a number of other links with resources that we have available for you. So we still don't know what our next webinar will be, but likely we'll be having one in November, as the Adaptations and Future Webinar series is now moved to once a month. But if you miss us, you can always watch recorded webinars on the site that I have already in the chat. We also have this Community Adaptations Hub that it's not necessarily a webinar format, it's not necessarily recorded. There's articles and links, and there are some videos and interviews on that site there. And also we have an ongoing peer exchange for local government recovery leaders or staff people. And we meet every other week, and we also have a password protected site with a number of resources. We'll be launching a smaller mentorship program for those who are involved in the peer exchange network. And so I will drop those links into the chat. And with that, I would just like to give a really warm thank you to all of our presenters, to Clay, Tara, Lori. It's really wonderful to hear your perspective, and I'm really impressed with all of the work that you have all been doing. So thank you for presenting, and thank you to everyone who has attended. I am looking forward to connecting with you during our next webinars as well as offline. So thank you all, and have a wonderful October.